Hello, everyone. My name is Litiane Barbosa Macedo. I am from Brazil at the Federal University of POE.
And hello, my name is Bernadette from the Vienna University of Economics and Business in Vienna, Austria.
And we are going to present a work, which the title is COVID-19 and the Global Health Threat of Vaccine Hesitancy, a transitivity analysis of COVID-19 anti-vax discourses in Brazilian, Portuguese, and German on Twitter. To start, we're going to give a little bit of contextualization of our work. The COVID-19 pandemic has accelerated the spread of misinformation and conspiracy narratives, has further revived anti-vaccine movements all around the globe. So the exploitation of anti-vaccine discourses has recently also joined the research agenda of linguistics and critical discourse analysis. This research, they suggest that anti-vax discourses differ between countries and languages. And this kind of a piece of research, they also have presented some patterns related to vaccine in general. Not specifically related to the vaccine against the COVID-19, right? And so far as we know, right, there is no research, a comparative research in terms of different contexts as we are trying to do here. So our objective then is to analyze, describe, and compare anti-vax discourses and fake news circulated as a part of anti-vax tweets in Brazilian, Portuguese, and German, right? So for the purpose of this research, the corpus encompassing tweets posted in January 2021 under the general hashtags vacina and impunge in Brazilian, Portuguese, and German was compiled, right?
Regarding the methods, we used a social media critical discourse studies framework as proposed by Kozravinik in 2018 and examined the linguistic resources through the transitivity system proposed by Halliday. Further regarding the methods, just a short overview, we followed 3 steps and started with the qualitative coding of the message tone based on the identified attitude and a common code book. And in the second step, we then did the transitivity analysis and analyzed all the elements that we before had coded as either anti-vax or vax skeptical. And in a third step, we then interpreted and discussed and compared the results within a social media critical discourse studies framework. Okay, so now regarding the message tone, we just want to give you an overview of our data due to time constraints. So with regard to the German tweets, there was a clear majority of tweets that we coded within MaxQDA as neutral, so without a clear anti-vax or pro-vax orientation. It was mostly informative tweets referring, for example, to the vaccination policies of the countries, mainly Germany and Austria. Then there was a similar amount of pro-vax tweets and anti-vax or vax skeptical tweets. So there were 421 pro-vax tweets that clearly showed orientation in favor of the vaccination, and 535 anti-vax or vax skeptical ones being the ones that we will then afterwards also focus on with regard to the specific topics and the transitivity analysis. And then there was a very small amount of around 285 tweets that were unclear in their orientation because of lacking intertextual elements, or they were not COVID related, so they were focused on other vaccines, but that was a very small amount.
Mm-hmm. Related to Brazilian Portuguese tweets, we also can notice the same pattern in terms of neutral, right? We have almost 48.9, almost 50% of the amount of tweets related to also this idea of informative, talking about vaccine policies, negotiation to get the vaccines, right? Related to the government and other kinds of institutions as well. And differently from German tweets, we can notice that pro-vax was the second most recurrent ones. which means that people were in favor of the vaccination and providing narratives related to convince others that the vaccine was a safe procedure, and all the kinds of studies related to talking about the vaccine safety. And as we could notice, also different from German tweets, there were very few anti-vax and vax-skeptical. They represent only 3.4% of the tweets, and only unclear and not COVID related were related also. They represent only 10% of the tweets in terms of message tone.
And now moving on to the transitivity patterns in the German anti-vax and vax-skeptical narratives only. So the transitivity patterns were only analyzed for the anti-vax and vax-skeptical narratives. And since there was such a huge amount of 535 verbal segments and 76 visual elements coded as either vax-skeptical or as anti-vax, and for the German data, we used EndConc to identify the top 10 verbal processes, and then we only analyzed the 10 most frequent verbal processes. And as we can see here on the left-hand side, it was mainly relational and material processes that appeared in the data. So processes related to be in the present, in the past, and also to the verb impfen, which is to vaccinate, and to have. There were also some existential processes with gibt, so there is. And when looking into the processes, we can see that there was a very strong focus on the passive and on abstract and impersonal actors. And this also shows how the orientation of the anti-vax and vax-skeptical narratives focused on the goals of some unknown and obscure entity. And the ones enforcing this plandemic, as it was called in the data, on both anti-vaccinationists and pro-vaccinationists remained largely abstract and obscured in the material processes. And they were either realized in the passive or constructed with impersonal or abstract actors. And the vaccination, as well as the COVID-19 crisis itself, were also frequently realized as goals in material processes, so as if the vaccination would lead to the pandemic and reinforce that the pandemic goes on. And along with other goals that were mentioned frequently, such as killing, the creation of new virus variations, or the purposeful creation of new features, also for the discrimination of people. And in the few material processes where actors are explicitly referred to, these are commonly known actors, also part of well-known conspiracy narratives, such as the WHO, so the World Health Organization, or Bill Gates, along with pharmaceutical industries, such as, for example, BioNTech, and also local politicians in charge of vaccination strategies, such as the former Austrian Minister of Health, Anschober, or the German Minister of Health, Spahn, and the mass media. They were also constructed as actors who give energy inputs and uphold this plandemic. Further actors explicitly named were also Nazis, getarnt as Antifa, so Nazis disguised as Antifa, and indeed reference is very frequently made to the Nazi period, which is employed within the German dataset, as I said, as a kind of dystopian future scenario towards which the vaccination leads.
The Brazilian Portuguese anti-vax or vax-skeptical narratives, on the other hand, since it was like a very small amount of tweets, right? We analyzed them all, actually, all the occurrences, and then we could see, right, which process types were most recurrent ones. And according to our analysis, most of them were material processes. It's interesting because although the material processes, they were the most recurrent ones. They served as a sort of a part of telling the stories, right? Telling the concrete events, but they were the result of relational and mental processes. As we noticed that the most recurrent kind of a process would be to have and to be, because in English, in Portuguese, would be ter, right? But since like in terms of translation and meaning, some parts of them related to be as a translation, right? So mental processes, they also play a very important role because they were involving participants related to desire and the feelings, especially the idea of not wanting, right, the vaccine. So this kind of process was very recurrent. We also had verbal processes, such as to mention that someone said something, or even the represented participants, they were engaged to kind of arguments, right? And there's just one occurrence of existential and behavior process. So they were not so important in terms of the narrative, right? And in terms of the frequent participants, we noticed that differently from the German tweets, they were named. We had like personalized, especially individual people, they were mentioned. Here we noticed that the participants such as you, in terms of people directly speaking to the person who is reading that kind of tweet. Also, I, by restating mental processes, right? Especially I don't want, I think, right, to tell their opinions, right? The Brazilian president was very recurrent in the anti-vax narratives, and although he was not directly, he was not his tweets, right? But he was mentioned and he was aligned with the participants as well. For instance, there is an example that someone mentioned that I and the President Bolsonaro don't want the vaccine. So he was aligned and tied to the idea of anti-vax discourse. He was very present. And I also had like other politicians as a result of the criticism. For instance, governors, the Minister of Health on that time. Very few occurrences related to vaccine companies such as Pfizer, right? The vaccine itself always as the object, in the sense of getting some sort of action related to the vaccine, right? Especially mental ones, right? We also noticed that were mentioned like family members such as grandfather, uncle, like people who got vaccinated, or people who don't want to get vaccinated, or somehow related to fake news, right? Because some kind of practice, which is very common in Brazil, that we have WhatsApp groups, and then these relatives, they spread news all over this kind of channel, right? We also notice evangelical pastors, not directly them as the writers of tweeters, but they were mentioned, especially when we got news that some of them were trying to impede the indigenous people to get vaccinated. So there were lots of passages and mentioning their names related to this piece of news. Some people agreeing that they should really interfere in this kind of national plan.
So due to time constraints, we would now like to give an insight into one aspect that we encountered within both data sets and present some example tweets. And this aspect regards the strong interdiscussivity and the de- and recontextualization of narratives that are in a sense specific for the socio-political context in which the users forwarded those tweets. For the German anti-vax tweets, it was in this regard very striking to notice how the narrative guides the perspective of the readers towards dystopian Third Reich related goals that are pursued in a sense by an obscure abstract entity. And we found several future-oriented relational and material processes that narrate a future that is dominated by censorship, euthanasia, dictatorship, discrimination, killing fee, more vaccinations, and also several virus mutations. And while the anti-vax and vax-skeptical tweeters represent themselves as both figures of resistance and awake victims, the pro-vaccinationists, they're represented as lost victims. And the anti-vax activists, they relate themselves also very much to resistance fighters who fought against National Socialism and the Third Reich. And they even equate themselves with victims of National Socialism, such as Jews, for example, in the German data. And the example on the left-hand side, the tweeter asks in a future-related material clause, wann wo der erste Politiker die Grenze überschreitet und Unwillige wegsperren will. So when will the first politician cross the line and lock up those not willing to get vaccinated? And then the tweeter goes on in a relational clause to define that it, so this moment, this scenario, as no longer far away, so it's no longer far until then, weit ist es nicht mehr hin. And then in an impersonal verbal clause, the obscured sayer man, so one, will probably write the verbiage impfen macht frei on this lager, on this camp. So the tweet states, one could write on the lager, on the camp, vaccinating makes free. And this verbiage is a clear analogy to the lettering that during the Nazi period, during National Socialism, was written on the concentration camps. That was written Arbeit macht frei, and here we have Arbeit substituted by impfen, so work is substituted by vaccinating. And then the tweet concludes by saying, at the latest then, everything is probably too late. So spätestens dann ist aber wohl alles zu spät. And they were calling the reader to wake up soon in order to avoid such a dystopian Third Reich scenario.
Regarding the example of Brazilian Portuguese tweets that we talked in terms of interdiscussivity, this Brazilian Portuguese example shows that this interdiscussivity related to the feminist movements related to sexual and reproductive rights. So here we have a fake dialogue, someone pretending that there was a talk between two people, right? And it appears processes such as material, relation, and verbal as a part of narration, right? And in this fictional dialogue, right? For instance, we have I don't want to take the vaccine, like the first fictional participant would say, I don't want to take the vaccine, my bodies, my rules. So this kind of sentence, right, of this argument that people from feminist movements related to the reproductive rights they mentioned, right? And the next line, it's the answer to say, oh, if you don't take the vaccine, right, it's implicit, but this also puts in risk other people's life, right, if you don't take the vaccine, right? And then the person said, oh, you're right, right? But now let's talk about abortion. So here, this construction of this narrative shows that they use the same rationale to mention the individual rights of the own body in terms of choosing or not the vaccine, equivalent to the idea of getting a safe abortion. So the idea of having their own rights to choose whether they want to do with their bodies or not, right? So in this sense, not only we see the appropriation of discourse, right? But we also see the argument that shows that the writer is against the abortion.
So arriving at our final remarks and conclusions, what our comparative analysis has shown is that there are specificities that clearly shape the German and Brazilian Portuguese anti-vax tweets. So we did find differences in the topics and amount of data. And for the German tweets, it was very striking to see this strong relation to the period of Nazism and to the past, the history of Austria and Germany. At the same time, we also found several similarities in terms of the discursive patterns of Brazilian and German anti-vax arguments. And these include, for example, a strong focus on interrogative statements that we found in both data sets, e.g. regarding the vaccine's effectiveness and also the safety, and this idea of calling the audience to wake up and to understand that we need to be more skeptical about the vaccination in a sense. Then there was also this common aspect of a strong relationship between the vaccine as carrier and negative attributes, such as poison, danger, and similar. Then, specifically, as in the German data, there was a strong focus on negative self-definitions and on what is not existent. So this can also be related to characteristics of anti-languages, as described by Halliday, in which this anti-reality is in a sense defined by what there is not and what they are not, also the anti-vaccinationists, rather than what they are or what they stand for. And what we also found in both data sets is this recontextualization and appropriation of discourses, by means of which discourses put forward by historically or marginalized groups, historically marginalized or marginalized groups, are in a sense decontextualized and then subsequently recontextualized within the COVID-19 pandemic to construct the anti-vax activists as victims of a dictatorship of pro-vaccine policies. And we have seen that with the example before related to the vaccination makes free, in a sense, sentence, the analogy to the Nazi sentence on the concentration camps, and to the example mentioned for the Portuguese tweets with regard to abortion rights.
And then we have the references in case you are interested to see further information. And thank you very much for this opportunity.